So I want to welcome everybody to the Historical Society's Fireside Chats. This is the 21st in our series of chats, and we just try to take an oral history of long-standing members of the community. And tonight's chat will be David Zweig. And thank you for making it through the yellow rainstorm, for those of you that did, and leave it to Sharon and David then.
Erica, thank you very much indeed. Does this sound very loud to everybody?
Perfect.
Sounds great. David, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Well, I'm honored to be invited to do this.
Quite right too, because you're in the company of some very august guests.
Right. Most of them aren't here.
We have a number of previous guests on the Fireside Chat, and a feature of the Fireside Chats in the past is that people such as Rob, and Vivian and Annika have lived in Hong Kong for in excess of a very, very long time. So we have a very interesting story here. You came to Hong Kong in 1996.
Before we start, I just want to mention that I have this card here which says, Joy P. Zweig wishes to apologize for her husband's behavior on the night of, and so this is the night of the 11th of May. So Joy would like to apologize for anything that I say that insults anybody or is inappropriate, because I can do that.
We'll hear a bit more about the lovely Joy's fortitude when it comes to her husband as we get going on this chat.
She's laughing, it's good news.
And I wondered at one stage whether Joy should have been the guest rather than you should have been. But we're looking forward to you, David.
Okay.
David, you came to Hong Kong in 1996. You were born in Toronto. You were brought up in a very sort of traditional conservative Jewish family. Your mother,
Vice President of the Junior Congregation.
And your mother, age 91, is still living in Toronto.
Correct.
With your sister. You had a traditional Jewish background. You went to a Jewish day school.
Till the end of grade 8.
And at school learned Hebrew.
Half a day.
And that's contributed to your ability now to speak fluent Hebrew.
I think the note that I said to you was conversant. Conversant.
We'll get the Israelis to test you. So.
Yeah, conversant.
In 1968, you spent the summer on kibbutz.
Correct.
And what were you doing there?
That's a dangerous question. I was cutting bananas. I mean, I only did it for a couple of weeks because I went to live with cousins in Ramat Gan. I have cousins. There's three. I have two cousins who were born. Three of us were born. They're my second cousins. We were born within about 5 months of each other, and so I've grown up knowing them, and so I went and stayed with them. And then one of my father's first cousins sent me on to a kibbutz to spend some time there.
Now you're known
as cutting bananas, not a lot of fun.
But you know your bananas anyway. You're known as a renowned Chinese specialist, and that course for you started in the autumn of 1968 when you started university at 18 years of age at the York University in Toronto. And there you studied...
It's actually my second year there. I did a paper, and the paper was on Chinese foreign policy. At that point, we were pretty active as a students. Many of the students who were on the left side, sort of left-leaning students, we got involved in trying to change courses, restructure the syllabus. We had protests. I was involved in anti-war movement because the Vietnam War was going on, and there were Canadians who were participating, and we got involved in a lot of those activities. And so we reorganized a course, and in that course I wrote a paper about Chinese foreign policy. That was the first time that I looked at the case of China.
And what particularly appealed to you about Chinese politics and Chinese foreign policy?
Yeah, well, two things. One was in terms of foreign policy, which is where I got mostly involved, was you had the U.S. at that point. Many people on the left were accusing it of imperialism, colonialism, neo-colonialism, just being involved in the war in Vietnam. And so we were critical of that. And on the other hand, you had the Soviet Union, which had just invaded Czechoslovakia, had suppressed, the Czech Spring. And so the two sides looked really not very appealing. And here was Mao presenting a non-interference in other people's affairs, this kind of third road. I can see one of my friends making a face, but that's the way we saw it. And China did a very good job those days of projecting that kind of image. So a lot of us were attracted, and then domestically, those of us who knew were studying socialism or knew something about it, we knew that Stalin was a mass murderer and killed a lot of people. And somehow Mao was seen, and now in the end we know it wasn't really true, but Mao was seen as someone who had a better face of socialism. He had a famous quote that said, "People aren't like worms that you can cut off the head and the head will still grow back, or the animal, the worm will still continue to crawl." So we thought that he was much more humane about that. So that got some of us involved.
Yes, and certainly the late 60s was a time of militancy worldwide.
Sure.
With riots all over the world. And it's interesting that Toronto was caught up in that.
Yeah, well, one of the biggest event I was at was right after Kent State, when the 4 American students were killed on Kent State. We showed up. There must have been about 10,000 of us outside the U.S. consulate. And right after that, we saw violence. About 100 kids broke off and went down the street and smashed windows in downtown Toronto. But we were very active on that. Turns out we were being investigated by the RCMP. That's the police. My mother was always nervous about me doing those kinds of things.
Sure.
Yeah, she's a Jewish mother.
You graduated and then you spent 1972 through to 73 on an adventure traveling worldwide.
Traveling around the world. That was the first time I came to Hong Kong in 73. I worked for my dad's company for about 5 months, saved at that point $2,500, and with that was able to travel around the world for 10 months. Which was quite amazing. I bought an airline ticket from Sri Lanka that sort of went all the way up, all the way, stopping all the way, finally ending up in Los Angeles for $315 US. Right? It was a year-long Korean Airlines ticket. So in those days you could do a lot of that stuff. But I went to a lot of places, had a lot of interesting experiences. Met some Jewish people along the way where I could, but it was predominantly just sort of an eye-opening event. And then I went back to York and spent my year doing a master's in international relations. And the deal was that if I did that, I would then be able to go to China. They would send me to China, because York University was one of 3 universities in Canada that had exchange programs with China. And so people at York, and in fact, one of the notes I made is that 2 of them were Jewish. They're still one, Dan Tradiak, who some people here know, and Dan was my professor, and another guy named Bernie Froelich. These have been my friends for life. Bernie's almost in this picture. I think Bernie's almost in this picture at the wedding. He marched at our wedding. They were very keen on someone who was interested in China. They had a very strong China program. So the deal was, if I came back, did a master's degree, they would support me to go to China. And so I did it. And there we go.
And you moved to China in 74. You had a 2-year stint in China at that stage, learning Chinese at the Beijing Institute of Languages, and then moving on to Peking University. And did you feel during that time, this is now sort of early to mid-70s, that you were becoming increasingly politicized?
Well, I've always felt that those of us who went center-left moved further to the left, because it was really a pressure cooker. I mean, there was no alternative values, no alternative ideology. We really got, even as simple as the language texts that we use were commie speak. You couldn't say anything. You couldn't learn a word that wasn't, we learned, long live Chairman Mao. Or, those were the kinds of things. And they had dictionaries like that that had these kinds of things. So that was if you came with a slightly center-right, that you came a little critical, then you would say, this place is just full of it. This is ridiculous. So I went to the left. And in the summer of 75, my mother still remembers, and Bernie Froelich still pushes it, that when I came back that summer, I talked about violent revolution in Canada.
An extraordinary concept.
It may have deserved it at that point, but nonetheless. So I was really pulled to the left in that first year. And then I went home during the summer. My parents freaked out because I was speaking so radically. And then I went back, and then the following year, we'll talk in a second about how things started to become clearer. The problems in China became much clearer. But before that, we went to factories, we worked in the countryside, we talked to peasants, we helped peasants plant grain and cut grain and worked in the fields and all that. So it was all very, we felt wonderful about it all.
And in that environment, which was essentially political, and where there is little, if any, room for any religion at that time of Chinese development, did you find that Judaism was no longer a part of your life, that you were ready to...
It's taking you a long time to lead to that picture, Sharon, right? So here, can I stand up? Can you follow me? So this is a picture of a Passover Seder, right, in a Muslim restaurant in Beijing. That's me on the left. This is a woman named Beverly Hooper. This is a very close friend of mine, Jeremy Paltiel, who teaches Chinese politics, and David Dukes, who's an Australian who actually made Aliyah at a certain point from Australia. So we had our own little, that was part of what we could hang out.
And it felt easy and comfortable and right for you to do so, to maintain links to your Judaism in the middle of all this sort of cultural upheaval.
Well, glad you asked that, because one of the really interesting things that happened to us in that period was we were surrounded by Palestinians. China had a very close tie to the PLO. So we had a PLO office. We had a couple of students who were from the PLO in the Beijing Languages Institute. I was generally okay with the PLO students. I was much less comfortable with the PFLP and the PDFLP. So the PFLP is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was George Habash's group. And then the PDFLP was even more extreme, and they were in Syria. And I was not so comfortable. But I did make a visit with Jeremy, one of the people up there. We did, and Ted came with us. We went to visit the PLO office and had a conversation. And the guy, one of the students, Mustafa, actually eventually became the head of the PLO office. And so we were, from that time on, and even before that, but from that time on, I was sort of a two-state solution kind of person. But I remember feeling extremely stressed when the guys from the PDFLP would give me dirty looks. That didn't make me... There were probably days when I wasn't sure that I was going to wake up the next morning, thinking that maybe... that's, it's my own problem, too.
You were totally immersed in life in China, and then your world becomes completely turned upside down when you receive a call on the 1st of March in 1976.
Yeah, I can still visualize middle of the night or morning getting a phone call, getting a knock on the door from a guard. We were already at Peking University, and I can still visualize coming down the stairs and seeing the phone off the hook. And the phone off the hook was my brother-in-law. My dad had died, and he had actually had a stroke when he was 44, when I was 16, and died at that age of 53. And so I had to get my butt back to Toronto, and they held up the funeral. But what I did, which I always, for me was meaningful, was that I went for a walk. Peking University has a lake called No Name Lake, Wuminghu, and I walked around that at 4 o'clock in the morning singing the song Echa. Echa Yashva Bada, which is, I think, a prayer for the destruction of the temple. At least that's how I remember it. And so I just walked around for about an hour just singing that song, trying to comfort myself.
Had your father been a big supporter of you traveling to China, studying in China, and becoming a China specialist? Was it the career he wanted?
Funny you should ask that. So that's a big issue, and that was a huge issue. My father had 3 pillars in his life: his family, Israel, and his business. And China was anti-Israel, anti-capitalist, And in those days, people used to think that China was opposed to the family, communal living, and free sex. I mean, people used to even talk about that. They called it 一杯水, a glass of water for anybody who wanted it. So my father basically hated my choice. And I got into law school the summer before I did my trip around the world, but I was traveling around for the summer, traveling through Europe. And he called me to tell me that I'd gotten into law school. He was very excited. And I said, tell the law school that I'm not coming and that I'm going back to York University to study China. Well, after that summer, I came back. My father didn't talk to me. And that went on for a couple of months. And then finally, one day, he was sitting in the den in our house, and I went to him and I sat down, sort of really emotional. Anybody who's listening knows if your dad doesn't give you the blessing, I mean, that's one of the big things in the Jewish heritage. You want your dad's blessing, right? And so I said to him, Dad, you have to be comfortable with that I'm going to make the right choices for myself, or if you're not, then you're never going to be happy with what I do in my life. And he looked at me and he said, well, then I'm never going to be happy with what you do with your life. And the sword that sort of went into my heart and the psychological pain was quite great. But I didn't quit. I wish there were more parents here. I would say to them all, let your kid do what they want to do.
I think the room is pretty full of that.
I just, but just about everybody here, their kids have already gone on. But I firmly believe that that's, a really important lesson. I mean, I believe that my father made a huge mistake. And it took me years to recover, but I have forgiven him and I'm fine with it. And now my mother actually started to tell me, my dad died, and then after he died, my mother said, Dad was always very proud of you going to China. I said, really? She said he would go to bar mitzvahs and people would say, where's your son? And he'd say, he's in China. And they'd go, really? He says, yeah, he got a fellowship from York University to go to China. But wouldn't tell me that he was proud of me for doing that. Would have made it a lot easier.
This is your dad.
That's my dad there.
There's a huge similarity. And was your father born in Toronto?
Yes, both my parents were born in Toronto.
And your grandparents?
The first Zweig to go to Toronto was 1905, after the failed Trotsky Revolution. Right? Trotsky leads a revolution against the Russians, fails, then there's pogroms, and that's usually a good time for Jews to get the hell out of Europe. And so that was when my great-uncle, my grandfather's brother, went, and my grandfather went in 1919. On my paternal side and on my maternal side, my grandparents went on their honeymoon in 1914. For their honeymoon, they went to Canada and stayed because World War I broke out. So we've been in Canada with everybody for well over 100 years.
You obviously deal with the immediate consequences of your father's death in 1976, and later that year start your PhD.
Well, let me just say that. So he died, and I raced back. A very long time, very long flight. Took me 40 hours to get home. But by that time, because we're skipping this, right? And so what happened was that at that point I started to have a sense. People were thinking that politics was very stable in China, and I thought politics was very unstable, that the Gang of Four, sort of the radical Maoists, that Mao and his wife and their supporters were really about to go to war with Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, and the more moderate people who eventually win and push the reform. And so I sat there with Dan Tretiak at my father's yard site, and we wrote an op-ed, which we were going to send in saying, be ready, the hits, the stuff's going to hit the fan. And I decided, well, I'm going back to China, maybe I don't want to write it. So I didn't write it. And then I get back, and then very soon after getting back, the politics starts to break out into the streets of China. And what happened was, Zhou Enlai dies. Deng Xiaoping has been carrying out a series of reforms which very much mirror the reforms that he begins in 78, but he tries it first in 75, and the Gang of Four block him. And some of us were hearing, and when they block him, some of the people try and support him, and so people go to Tiananmen Square. This is actually the first Tiananmen Square event, which is 1976, April. And This picture here is about 500,000 people in the square in support of Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping and hoping for reform. And that really gave me a very clear message that a lot of people were opposed to the leftism, opposed to the extremism. And this is another picture of me there. You can see the photo of Zhou Enlai in there. And this is really the first Tiananmen event that most people actually don't know very much about. But it was fascinating. I mean, in China in 1976, you would have figured 500,000 people showed up. The next day, 10,000 people show up and they get their heads beat. But that day was a good day for me to go, and I have great slides from all that. So that helped me start to make the mental transition away from the leftism also.
This incentivizes you to study further. You start your PhD program at the University of Michigan.
Yep.
You start that in 76 and conclude that in 83. And your supervisor at that time was also a very political character.
Yes, Mike Oxenberg. He was probably the leading China specialist in the United States at that time, or one of the two, and he was the advisor to Jimmy Carter on Carter's National Security Council and was engaged in negotiating normalization with China. Michigan has had three professors doing Chinese politics who have been members of the National Security Council, of different professors, so it's a very strong place.
You then spend a year in 1980 through to 81 doing field work in China.
Yeah, in 1980, through the Canadians, I got a chance to go to China to do research for my doctoral thesis. And what I was looking at was agricultural policy in the Cultural Revolution period, but right at that time, China was in the process of a complete de-collectivization. They were ending the people's communes, partly just on their own. People were doing it, but also partly with the blessing of Deng Xiaoping. And so I would go out and ask people questions about what had happened in the 60s and 70s, and then ask them what was going on today. How are you feeling about, the end of the communes? And so that was a really great opportunity for me.
And in those days, how comfortable were people talking to you?
Those were already easy days compared to the days of 74, 75, 76. Those were really tough times. The early times were much tougher. People, they knew I was officially there. I would go around every day out to villages, look for local officials, particularly if the rain and it was muddy and you were walking in mud that was this thick. Those were great days to go out because people really felt that you were committed to what you were doing. You'd go into their homes, you'd start throwing around cigarettes with them and sitting down and smoking cigarettes. And then at lunch they'd pull out the white lightning and you'd all have to get drunk together. And they would tell, I learned an awful lot. People were quite honest. I think some people lied, people in power might have lied, and then someone would come along to me and say, what that guy told you yesterday is not true, and that what in fact is going on, the real truth is, here's the real truth. So it was great. I did want to mention, just in passing, that for those of you who've done business in China, you know that drinking is part, at least particularly previously, it's one of the best things about China now is that Chinese like red wine, right? Because now if I want to drink with people, I can drink red wine. People don't realize how difficult it was when I would go and do research. There was one time where I drank 4/10 of a liter of the equivalent of Maltai, but you're talking serious gasoline, right? You're talking 120 proof, right? You're talking 60% alcohol. I would drink 4/10 at lunch, 4/10 at night. The next morning I got up, I drank 4/10 again for lunch. I went into the back, shoved a chopstick down my throat, drew up, so that I could come back and continue to drink. But all this was to do my research.
It sounds as though you were pretty happy drunk, but you managed to keep going there.
The worst time I got drunk, I once drank 6/10 of a liter, and I had this long conversation with a local leader's official about having her tubes tied, because we were talking about birth control, right? And one-child policy was very strong, and I still remember that. There were times where some guy faked drinking with me,
Actually,
right? Where I would be drinking
idea.
and you want to move on. And he just threw it over his shoulder, and I've never forgiven that guy for
But it sounds as though it's just as well in 1982 when you went on to safer ground and started teaching in Florida.
International
And
University.
at that stage you had a Harvard postdoctoral fellowship. And
Soon after.
you were able to turn your PhD into the first of your books.
Right.
So you're in very comfortable ground in Florida, able to see family. And
I saw more relatives in Miami when I was teaching in Florida in Kendall. I saw more relatives coming down and visiting than I would have seen almost anywhere else in the world. Right? My father, when he died, was in Fort Lauderdale. My Zeta my grandfather died in Miami Beach. My Auntie Mary, my great aunt, died in Miami Beach. I mean, Jews go to Toronto, Jews die in Florida. It's just something that they do, right? And so it was very comfortable for me to teach for those 2 years in Florida. You know? And every Shabbos I get in the car and drive up to West Palm Beach where my mother was, and we do Shabbos. It was great.
Then the move in 1986 to Boston, where you're teaching at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which is an interesting school for you, not
Sure.
sort of necessarily a natural diplomat, but a nice place for you
Sharon.
to be. And you're teaching Chinese politics, and that takes you through to 1989 when you made an extraordinary trip to North Korea.
First trip was that year was an interesting year. I went to North Korea with some people from the university, from my school, in 1989. And the interesting thing was, you know, I didn't get a chance to, I mean, besides the Palestinians who were students with us, you know, we had an incredible collection of students in those days back in 1974. We had North Koreans, we had communist Vietnamese from South Vietnam, you know, NLF, National Liberation Front doctors. We had Sihanouk's children, or grandchildren. One of them was killed by the Khmer Rouge. We had Albanians, and we had North Koreans. And one of the North Koreans who was with us in those days, turns out I go to North Korea in 1989. We go to the Koryo Hotel, which is this huge hotel, and there he is. Hadn't seen him since 1975, and he's Kim Il-sung's Chinese translator. So he was there because Yang Shang-kun, who was the president of China, was coming to visit, and so he was there to translate for Yang Shang-kun and to arrange for the visit of Yang Shang-kun. So we sat down for an hour and had a terrific conversation. I don't remember what we talked about, but it was, you know, these guys were not so bad. But one thing that was really interesting, I remember very much in the Korea trip. The North Korea trip was, you know, when we went there in '89. At one point we went over to, I was with a group of people and we were talking to Korean scholars and everything, and we went over to a window, this one guy, and I'm standing there, the two of us are looking out the window, and he turns to me and he says, you know, we aren't all crazy. I thought that was rather interesting. That, he was sort of saying that even back then, that they knew the system, you know, they were reading the New York Times in his research institute, so.
Late 80s and certainly 1989 brought lots of dramas of its own. You return from North Korea and receive a call that's really set to put you on track in terms of defining moments as far as China is concerned.
Sure.
So in May 1989, as the prelude to the entire Tiananmen Square drama, you receive a call from the assistant for Ted Koppel.
Right, a woman named Tara Schonenstein, another Jewish girl, Tufts graduate, phones.
And Ted Koppel was the anchor for ABC television.
He was the anchor, and at that point he was also just stepping out to do his own series of specials on main events. He wound up doing 4, he set up his own company.
And what did they want from you?
They wanted me to go to China and to help Ted cover what he thought was going to be a crackdown in Tiananmen Square. This was already Monday, something like the 25th before the June 4th crackdown, and Ted had a sense that things were going to go badly, that there was going to be a big crackdown. And so he wanted to have people working for him in Beijing. Now, the Beijing city government had made a rule that Chinese could not speak to foreign journalists. So Ted decided rather than find journalists, he would find academics. So Tara phoned a professor at Tufts, a good friend of mine, Don Klein, and said, Don, would you like to go? Don was 65 years old. He says, not on your life, but I got a guy who's perfect. So they called me and they said, would you like to go? And I said, what took you so long? Right? So I fly down to DC on Thursday morning, and I meet Ted Koppel, and Ted says to me that he wants me to go into China for him and find my friends, because I had already been going in and out of China at that point for about 10 years, and I had very good friends who were working for the reformist prime minister, a guy named Zhao Ziyang, who gets purged in '89. But many of my friends were very active in the reform wing of the Communist Party, so I knew them all, and they would have been involved in the Tiananmen events, sort of the hunger strike and all that. So I said, I'll go, but I'm not going to let you talk to them because they'll get in trouble, but I'll interview them, and then you interview me. So Ted says, fine. The next morning, I get on the plane, I go out to the airport, first class, flying out to San Francisco, and sitting in front of me is Tom Foley, the Speaker of the House, and sitting beside me is Leon Panetta, who will eventually become the Chief of Staff of the President and I think the Defense Secretary.
And head of the CIA,
maybe the head of the CIA, and the whole section is all congressional leaders who are on their way back for the weekend. And so I tell Panetta where I'm going, and he says, come and give us a talk when you come back. I never did it. But so I get to San Francisco, get on the plane, fly to Shanghai, land in Shanghai at 7:30 at night on June 3rd. And just, hey, we're here, and we get on the plane and we fly and we land in Beijing. And get off the plane, it's 10:30 June 3rd, right? It's Saturday night, 10:30, and I come off the plane. As I'm going down the escalator, I see there's nobody there, and I see these two guys, and I go up to them and I say, what's going on? And they say, the soldiers are out with they say this in Chinese, with their long swords, their dachang, or their changjiang, or what changjiang does, right? That they're bayonets, and that the soldiers had already begun to attack the city. And so I turned very quickly to the American tourists who had come in with me, and I say, don't bother unpacking. I said, when you go to your hotel, check in, and you'll be gone the next morning. So I get in the taxi with these guys, and we drive into the city, and there's buses flipped over. It's already late at night. There's soldiers sitting on trucks, along the way. And I'm just, we're chatting this whole thing up, and we're winding between buses that have been flipped over and all kinds of stuff. And eventually I get to the Zhengguo Hotel, which is one of the early foreign hotels there. And I go in, check in, I get on the phone, and I phone a guy named Jay Matthews who's working for the Los Angeles Times. And I say, what's going on? He says, everybody's going to the square. Anybody who's anybody is in the square. So I said, okay. So I go outside and I see a pedicab driver, a guy who's got a 3-wheel taxi, and I say, let's go to the square. And he says, okay. And I said, I'll pay you a lot of money. Don't worry about it. Let's go. So we just start wheeling towards the square. He's wheeling away. We go over one of the bridges. There's a dead guy lying on the bridge. I get off. We look around. We look down. There's trucks. There's jeeps. There's soldiers underneath one of the bridges, and we keep going. And then as we start to get near to Tiananmen Square, there would be constant rushes of people, of Chinese, sort of like this big of people sort of really scared, running at us, and the driver would pull over to the side, and we'd let this group go by, and then we'd keep going. And eventually we got right to the edge of Tiananmen Square, and there was an opening. And so we wheeled into the square, and we stopped in the square right in front of the Jinshuiqiao, the gold water bridge or something in front of Tiananmen Square. And I'm just standing on the 3-wheel taxi, and I can see lots of light in the way down there. I can see the obelisk, the monument to the People's Martyrs in the middle of the square, but I can't see that in fact there are 3,000 to 4,000 people sitting around it at that time. I can see a sort of a prefab structure that's on fire. And that turns out to be the headquarters of the independent trade union. That was already on fire. And then as I'm sort of looking at Tiananmen, as I look to the left, I can see soldiers lined up in the distance. And so I'm there for about a half an hour, just watching. And then the soldiers drop on their knees, aim their rifles, and the bullets start going over our heads. Now, it's very clear that they weren't shooting at us, at that point. But that was the time to get the hell out of there. And so immediately we just wheeled. And I can very clearly remember seeing a guy standing on some kind of barricade, holding a microphone, what do you call those things? A lapa, a megaphone. Thank you, Ted. And he's got a bandana on his head, and he's screaming something like, "Don't leave the square, protect the square, keep the square." But everybody, that's the only exit that existed. And so everybody was going out that way.
How long did you stay in Tiananmen Square for? In Beijing for?
I stayed for about 10 days. That night I immediately went to the office of Daniel Sutherland, who was the Washington Post correspondent, and told him what was happening. And he immediately had two stringers. And he turns to one stringer and he says, "You go to the Fuxing Hospital and see what's going on." And he turns to the other one, a young woman, and he says to her, "You go to Tiananmen Square and see what's going on." Right? He had been a war correspondent during Cambodia. And her name was Sarah Lubman. And I went over to him and I said, "Dan, can I talk to you?" I said, "You can't send a young woman named Sarah Lubman, whose father is Stan Lubman, who's one of the leading legal specialists on China, into the square now. If she dies, he'll sue your ass." And so he said, "You're right. Sarah, you go to the hospital." And to the other kid, he said, "You go to the square and see what's going on." So I hung out for 10 days. He, under fraudulent circumstances, got into Beijing. And then he and I spent some time together. And I took him out to Beida, to Peking University, one day and snuck him in. And then he proceeded to disappear. He had a small video camera, and he went around doing interviews with anybody he could find. I was terrified that I was going to get arrested because I had already lied to get him in. But he did a video, and then he interviewed me. And then we did that video, and that video wound up winning awards from Columbia University.
And the fact that you are a China commentator and you presumably say critical things about China, has that in any way hampered your access to China, either to people or to visiting the country?
Well, in general, no. The fact that I was in China right after Tiananmen and after Kabul left, I went down to Nanjing, where I had spent my 2 years doing my field research. I wanted to see what people in the countryside knew. I went back to visit all my friends in the countryside from my research days. I wanted to know what they knew and what they didn't know about Tiananmen Square. And it turned out that one of the foreign affairs officials at Nanjing University decided that if I was there, I must be a CIA agent. That's the only possible explanation why everybody else fled China, but I didn't. And I didn't flee because I was a CIA. Oh no, I didn't. Sorry, I didn't flee because I just was really interested, and I thought that given the people that I knew and all that, this was a great opportunity. So when I went back to China in 1991 to do field research, I had a really hard time at Nanjing University for a period of time. And I was eventually told that this guy was convinced that I was a CIA agent, and that he had told people that I was a CIA agent. But that was really the only time that I've had major problems. I mean, when China tightens up, we have a problem doing research. But one of the big things was after 1990s, coming here in 96, and then being here after the handover and not leaving, not panicking. Almost every expat teaching at Hong Kong U left, went off to Australia. And I'm Canadian, I'm not American, made a very big difference. And so really since 1996, even more than before, I've had really great access.
There are many of us in this room who were here in 1989 and were watching the events unfold on television. Not the same sort of coverage you get these days with BBC and CNN. We were all watching
Pretty
the
good
local
coverage, I
channels.
think.
It is extraordinary to think that we're coming up to the 25th anniversary of Tiananmen. In some ways it feels like no time at all, and in other ways it feels like a whole lifetime.
I'll have to remind my mother, because when I got back to the hotel that night, I phoned my friend Bernie Froelich and I said, Bernie, call my mother and tell her I'm okay. So Bernie phoned my mother and said, Belma, David's okay. She says, what do you mean he's okay? Why wouldn't he be? And then only then did Bernie said, turn on the TV, Belma. And then she discovered that I would, so that was in the
Do you
middle.
feel 25 years on that it will have any impact on Hong Kong in this coming year or in the future in terms of further reflections on what happened in 1989 in Tiananmen?
I think it'll probably get raised somewhat as we get to July 1st, that this is the 25th anniversary. We'll see what June 4th does here. I mean, everything's going to politicize events in Hong Kong now. You get the takeover of the legislative yuan in Taiwan, and that completely emboldens the students here in Hong Kong to take a much more radical position on, the political reform debate that's going on right now. So I think it'll just feed into it, but it won't be something very significant. But it also then leads officials on the mainland to arrest more and more dissidents and people who are dissatisfied and politically active on the mainland. And more that information comes back here to Hong Kong, the more that the average Hong Kong person will say, look, I don't want to be part of that system. Let's keep that system away from here as long as possible. Because I think that's one of the reasons that people here are so scared of the political reform if it's not moving forward towards democracy.
David, I'm going to move you through.
We have to jump.
I'm going to move you through some years so we can get you here in Hong Kong. But having got back from Tiananmen Square, you return to Boston. You go to the Jewish club in Boston and meet the woman who's to change your life entirely.
I would think I changed her life more than she changed mine. The line I said to her was, hold on to your seat, lady. We're going to get rocking.
Well, all that frenetic activity, but was it a very frenetically active first date?
No, it wasn't. I fell asleep on the first date. We were introduced and we went out on the first date. And at that point, I had just come back from Tiananmen. And I thought I might have been suffering from hepatitis. I did try and kiss her anyway. She didn't have to, thank you. She didn't have to, I didn't have to persuade her because I fell asleep during dinner. But she still went out with me again.
And very lucky you are too. You became engaged on the 1st of August 1990.
Right, Army Day. Pete, that's the founding day of the People's Liberation Army.
And you marry on the 4th of May 1991.
Right, May 4th movement, major event in Chinese history.
I want to ask, does your wife know that you link so many events to Chinese history?
Yeah, she did. I told her. Yeah.
In 91 and 1992, you get a scholarship to China, and you go with your young bride to Nanjing.
We got married on May 4th, and in the summer of 1991, I told her I was going to take her to the 21st century, the 20th century, and then the 19th century. And so the 21st century was we went to Japan, and we saw high-speed trains and all this kind of stuff. And then we came to Hong Kong, and that was sort of the 20th century. And then I took my poor bride to Nanjing in 1991. This is not China, this is China 25 years ago almost, right? So this is when everybody was still on bicycles. She got knocked down once on a bicycle, broke her watch. They would name stores after, that was the store that had, what kind of oil was it? That had some kind of oil, and so that became known as the what was the store?
Had Western Oil.
Western Oil.
Western Oil store.
Right, so that became the Western Oil store, because you couldn't find Western Oil anywhere else, right? And, I mean, so each store maybe had one product from the West that you could find.
Well, in this very sort of dynamic atmosphere where there's not much to do, Joy becomes pregnant, and she then makes her move back from China to the US. where after a dramatic birth, your first child, Rachel, is born in 1992.
The preemie, right? She was born at 952 grams, 27 weeks early. 27 weeks. Right, she was at 27 weeks, 13 weeks early. I got a phone call.
And very, very high drama, but you get back in.
I get a phone call that Joy's about to, almost give birth. She's now, at this point, she's in the hospital, sort of lying.
We'll leave Joy hanging. Thank goodness she had her daughter, your daughter Rachel, safely in 92. Aaron, your son, follows in 1996. And when Aaron was only 10 weeks old, the family moves to Hong Kong.
Right.
You move here because you hadn't secured tenure at Tufts and decided that Hong Kong would be an exciting opportunity for you as a family.
Well, Dan Trediak was here. I had been here in 73. I had crossed from here into China so many times. I had been here the whole fall of 1980, doing interviews for my doctoral thesis. And so this was very comfortable. The thought of coming to Hong Kong was really very easy.
You come to join the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology as an assistant professor. At that
Associate
stage,
professor.
Associate.
Without tenure.
And fortunately get your tenure in 2000. Had you any idea about whether Hong Kong would offer you any kind of Jewish life for you and for your family?
Well, I had been to the UJC to a Yom Kippur service at the Mariners. Was it the Seamen's or the
Yes,
Mariners?
the Mariners.
The Mariners Club. That's where it had held early services. Did you go? Yeah. So I went with Dan. I went with Dan Trediak, and so I knew that there was a Reform synagogue. And so we came here, and that first weekend, after we arrived, we drove and hung out at the pool downstairs because it had just opened up. The JCC had just opened up.
So you become involved in JCC life. Your children, certainly Rachel, becomes involved with Jewish education here.
Right, Shorshim.
Although you're from this conservative Jewish background, you become committed to the UJC. You're on the executive committee there.
I was always committed to a point because it was a reformed synagogue, and I never felt comfortable. It's one of the reasons I could have been president, probably. I was vice president. I was main fundraiser for 10 years. But I never felt that I wanted to be president because I never quite felt comfortable being part of a reform synagogue. I grew up conservative and very, very comfortable in a conservative synagogue. Same with Joy. We joined the UJC largely because I wanted this little kid to be able to read the Torah at her bar mitzvah. And she couldn't do that at Ohalea. And so we stayed with the UJC. And we always get, I'm a Zweig and Joy very much her family too. When we live in a community, we get engaged. Joy's been involved in all kinds of activities, continues to be involved, and I was, very involved with the UJC.
And you very quickly throw yourself into life, Jewish life, particularly in Hong Kong. You become a man who is known, a family that is known very much within the community. And that testing of your role within the community and the Jewish community for you is challenged to the full in February of 2004. When you receive a call from Joy that changes the entire Zweig family life.
This is the third phone call, right? My life is all full of. I was thinking about it later. We all must live this life when we travel a lot and live overseas. We always get these phone calls which tell us that somebody's in trouble, right? And we live with that. The phone rings at some time in the night, and it's like, oh shit, who's died, right? I mean, that's the world we live in.
So David, you get the phone call.
I get the phone call, and it's Joy telling me that her father died, and that she's got to go back to New Jersey for the funeral. And I'm in Shanghai doing research, and I say, okay, I'll be out the next morning. The next morning, I get up, I get on the plane, I fly into Hong Kong, get in a taxi, and I'm about to the taxi driver's driving in, and is soon to go to mid-levels where we live, and I put on my phone and I get this phone message that says, "Don't go home, come to the Queen Mary Hospital. Aaron's in the hospital." Pretty scary stuff. So I get in, I get the taxi driver to go over to Queen Mary, and I go, and eventually emergency, and I get there just as Aaron's about to sink off into La La Land, in the sense that I think they'd given him some medicine to try to put him to sleep, but he was able to just smile at me and a bit of a daze and say, "Hi, Daddy," and that was it. And he was in the intensive care unit, and that began for me, the saga, all the events, 55 days.
Now, very soon, the entire Jewish community in Hong Kong, regardless of which congregation it was,
Sure.
became totally focused on the Queen Mary Hospital and the later Grantham Hospital.
Yeah, Queen Mary was only one day. That night that Aaron was sick, K.T. Chow, the doctor, who was the head of the pediatric cardiology unit at Grantham, came over to the hospital to see him at 2:30 in the morning and told us that he was going to save Aaron, and that he was going to transfer Aaron the next day to the Grantham Hospital. So the next morning at 10 o'clock, we drive behind the ambulance, and the ambulance moves Aaron to Grantham Hospital, which is located just near the Aberdeen Tunnel.
Yes.
Yeah.
And very soon, as I say, the entire Jewish community becomes involved. Chabad with Rabbi Abson, the UJC with Lee Diamond.
Sure,
there are prayer meetings, not just for Aaron, but for Joy's father, all in the corridors.
Joy has to say Kaddish through this whole time. She's got her son lying there close to death, and she's got to say Kaddish for her father, who had just died, and she never made it home for the Shiva or for the funeral, which was always difficult.
And one of the things the Jewish community helped achieve for you was the securing of a particular machine that was absolutely necessary to ensure that Aaron would survive.
Right. Aaron got sick on a Wednesday morning, and got moved to Grantham on Thursday. On Friday, he had a good day. Well, Thursday he lost his leg because he had a blood clot. So we had to sign, Joy and I had to sign a piece of paper that authorized them to remove his leg. That was Thursday. Friday was a better day, and then Saturday they called us in and said he's not doing very well. And we think they knew about the pump because they had used it before. The doctors had the agent who handled the pump downstairs in the coffee shop waiting to come up to help us order the pump. There were about 15 of us sitting in the library in the hospital, and we just said to KT, "Okay, bring her up." She came up, and she told us about it, and then she told us how much it was going to cost, and one of the members there just decided that he or she was going to pay for it, and we expected to pay them back, to pay this person back, and then the community just mobilized and organized and raised $500,000 US.
And you've told me before that you remain indebted to many families in the congregation or in the community.
Aaron's bar mitzvah was, we felt very much one of the reasons we moved to Ohalea from the UJC was that's really the heart. In some ways, as a synagogue, that building is part of the heart of the community. It's much bigger, and we really felt that we wanted to have the bar mitzvah there because in many ways we feel Aaron belongs to the community.
And it's right that on a human level, you've mentioned families like the Kaminskis, the Kodrons, the Shabbats.
I'm not going down there in case I forget anybody.
You were providing food and sustenance, so not just money. The money is important, that's not the issue.
Right. Every morning there were people who came, the breakfast group, and
just emotional and spiritual support.
And Aviva Shabbat and Vered Nigar were the food team, and they organized meals for us. So we would sit there, and every day we had meals, lunch and dinner, for about 50 days. this went on. And just everybody was just as helpful as they could possibly be. It was just an amazing, amazing event.
And
we would stay. One of the amazing events of all that, we stayed up. The Children's Heart Foundation, which now many members of this community support, and which helped us, and they give money. But we stayed up, and they had a home called the House of the Heart up on the hill, and we would join. I stayed there most nights, so we could be in the hospital room in intensive care at 7 o'clock in the morning. And Shimon Peres came for one visit, and Peres came for a UIA dinner, and we were supposed to be there, and we couldn't go to the dinner. And someone told Peres that we were supposed to be there, and they told him about this issue. And at 11:30 at night, I got a phone call in the hospital from Shimon Peres to wish us good luck and to tell us, that he was praying for Aaron and all that. So it was all around the world.
It's
worldwide.
For sure, and I think Aaron definitely became a child of the community, and we were all delighted when he was in the games in Israel. This last year.
Right.
And he's on to college this autumn.
Yes, he is. Off to Bowdoin College.
So
Yes.
life very much moves on, and he and you and the family must feel very much sort of connected to Hong Kong as a result of that entire experience.
Of course.
You remain here, you remain active in Jewish life, you remain active in Chinese life.
Right.
You've written 4 books, the 5th is due to be published. You remain teaching, you have your contract extended now to 2019. And you're on Chinese TV, Phoenix TV, explaining Jews and Judaism to the Chinese.
Right, there's this big thing in China now that the Chinese have decided that they want to be like the Jews. So there's all these books that have been published, like how to be smart like the Jews, or how to get rich like the Jews. So one of the hosts of Phoenix Television, I had done Phoenix on political stuff, but they contacted me and they wanted me to come and they wanted me to answer questions like, why are Jews so smart? Now the Chinese want to figure out how 13 million people have 25% of all the Nobel Prizes, when no Chinese living on the mainland except for Mo Yan, right, who's an author, has ever won a Nobel Prize. So they sort of really want to figure out what's our trick. But in general, I would say too that I just, having stayed here, I'm just very lucky to be involved more and more with, be invited to talk about my own research to people on the mainland. I gave a president to the man who's the current vice president of China 2 years ago, telling him problems with his own policies. Recently, I've been invited by the Guangdong provincial government to write reports for them about politics in Hong Kong. So we're really very lucky in that sense. And I've still been able to keep my independent view, and when I don't like something, I say it.
And it's an important role, it seems to me, that you have this function of gesher, or bridge, between 2 very, very important communities, the Jewish and Israeli community and China, and that you play this essential role in assisting with the communication and enlightenment of knowledge between both communities.
Well, sure. Well, one of the things that had happened was, for many, many years, I did not talk very much about Israel here. I sort of felt that I'm a China specialist. I didn't want to get the waters murky. It was a little tricky, I felt. But then when the Israeli army went into Gaza after the Hamas had sent 7,000 missiles into South Israel, I decided this was enough baloney, that everybody was attacking Israel, and so I just decided it was time to go public. And so I did some radio talk shows on Backchat and other shows, talking, just sort of asking people, like, if you were if the Basques had been bombing Madrid and they put 7,000 missiles into Madrid and the Spanish army went into the Pyrenees to drive the Basques out, would the French have said, how could you do that? Right? So at that point I just said this was it. And so then after that I got even more involved, working closely with the consulate and just gotten more involved with Israel here.
And how optimistic are you in this sort of 25th anniversary of Tiananmen and these many years that you've been here now? How confident are you about the progression of Hong Kong politically and the connection between both Hong Kong and China? Is this a place where you feel safe and secure for the foreseeable future?
I think we'll know in a couple of months. We'll get our first message as to how well this is going to go. This is a very, very, very critical time right now. And I think some people don't recognize that, but I think it's really critical. And how China responds to what is clearly going to be an occupation of Central by the students, but whether they can cut a deal with the moderate democratic forces here and agree and take the risk that they need to allow the people of Hong Kong to take a major step forward in democracy in terms of being able to have very little constraints on who gets to run for the chief executive in 2017. If they get really uncomfortable and nervous about that, the Chinese, the central government, if they really try and stop that from happening, this place is, I don't have as much confidence in this place.
Well, David, we're going to look to you for insights in the future, and I want to thank you very much indeed for sharing so much of your life with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, David Zweig. Ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions, Richard?
What happened actually on June the 4th? Because you talked about 10:30 at night on a Saturday. Where were you the next day?
Oh, I went back to the hotel at the Zhenghua Hotel.
And watched it on TV?
No, just would go out. Actually, what I started to do was I got on my bicycle and started biking around the back streets of Beijing, talking to people, asking them what they had seen. I went looking for friends of mine because I knew Ted was coming and I needed to interview them. I also one day went out to Peking University on my own, biked out to Peking University on my own, and interviewed the head of the foreign student office, or someone who had been the head of the foreign student office when I was there in 75, 76, who I knew very well. And he was a terrific, his description, his explanations, his insights. He was an Indonesian Chinese who had come back in the 60s, and he was very insightful. And so that was great conversation. So I actually went around trying to just learn more about what had happened, because I hadn't been in Beijing in May until I showed up on the night of June 4th. So, and I hung out, we'd wake up 3 o'clock in the morning, the tanks would go by, and the whole Zhenghua Hotel would shake as the tanks would go by, and we'd wake up and we'd all go downstairs, and about 30, 40 of us would be standing there at the door looking out, trying to figure out what was going on. But we just, the journalists, it was basically journalists, photographers, and me in the hotel.
Any other questions?
Can you explain a little bit more your attraction to China? A little bit more, because what was the driving force? Why did you choose China?
Right. Well, part of it was that, as I said, sort of China in 68, 69, 70 was different. We thought was different from the U.S. I was always interested in politics. I wanted to study politics. Didn't want to go into my father's business. And so China was something different. And then I always got a lot of support from the people at York University. Once I showed an interest in China, they were very keen to give me all kinds of support to go to China. Another thing was my grades rose dramatically because I just somehow got interested. It sort of caught me. And it was a puzzle. One of the things I always remember was we didn't know very much. It wasn't like studying American politics where you could go out and do all these surveys. Somehow China was a puzzle. People didn't know much. Maybe that way you could say whatever you want and no one could challenge you, which was good. But in general, it was a puzzle. Also, Chinese and Jews have a lot in common. But I don't think that was a big driving force for me in those days. It was really very political. it wasn't so much Chinese culture. It was a really interesting country to study. Going there was really interesting. It gave me direction, much more meaning in my life, where I was sort of floating around, didn't really know what I wanted to do.
Yes, in the front.
In the early 80s, you must be the first student to do actual field research for your PhD thesis. How did you make it happen?
Sure, I was actually, the first group to get to the field was 1979-80, and I was 80-81. And I got in as a Canadian. The Canadian Foreign Ministry and the Canadian had a deal with the Ministry of Education of China to have a swap. Canadians could go and do research in China, and Chinese could come and study in Canada. And at that point, the rate was 500 to 1. The Chinese had sent 500 Chinese to Canada, and there'd only been one Canadian who had gone. So I thought that was a good route. So even though I was then a graduate student at the University of Michigan, that was a much better chance for me. And so I got in, and I went to Nanjing University. I wrote to a couple people at Beida to see if I could go to Beida, Peking University, to do research there. But Nanjing University at that point was by far the best university in China to organize field research. There was no other university in China that could do at that point what Nanjing University could do. And so they got me out to the field twice. Once, I bicycled out every day because they couldn't get approval for me to live there. Second time, they got approval for me to live in a commune. So I lived in a commune headquarters, and then I ran into trouble. And they didn't want to give me my third site. And the reason they didn't want to give me my third site was a guy named Stephen Mosier, who became very famous, who was a Stanford PhD. He had gone to the field in Guangdong and had done completely unethical behavior. Really unethical. He had brought in a van and told the local party leader that if he got good research, they could keep the van. He built a house in his wife's village. First of all, as an anthropologist, he shouldn't have gone to his wife's village, right? He went to his wife's village, all these kinds of things. So at that point, foreign scholars and students were really being prevented. So I then sent the word back to Oxenberg, my thesis supervisor, who at that point was in the National Security Council, and he was able to get Feng Yi, who was the head of science on the Politburo, to get Zhao Ziyang, who was the premier of China, to approve my third research site. So my third research site went all the way to the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and then I got out for my third research site. So it was quite...
Something to do with Oxenberg.
Oxenberg got me to my third research site. Oxenberg didn't have anything to do with the first two. That was really, I was able to do that as a Canadian and use the Canadian connections. So where I've been lucky, because I've had both the American connections and the Canadian connections.
Richard, yes.
Sorry, one more. With the continuing crackdown on dissidents and also China's crackdown on social media and people
Now,
you obviously talk about your ability to talk freely and freely put your views out there. And obviously, when you look at the Ming Pao situation with Pao and the editor, do you ever feel threatened? Do you ever feel wary?
yeah, I've actually, the time I probably was most chicken was I had done an interview let me say this. We sometimes get messages from friends on the other side who will say, don't talk about that topic. The one topic that I get warned about and I'm a little cautious about is human rights. Other than that, I'm not very cautious. So for example, the 9 dotted line for the South China Sea, I make it very clear anytime I get a chance to say to China, but Richard, the trick is to do it in a constructive way. So I will say to China, when they behave the way they're behaving now with Vietnam, they're just making so much trouble for themselves, right? Rather than saying, bad guys. So I will still talk about it. When we go on Phoenix television, there are topics we can't say. We can't use the word Tiananmen. I've been told that I can't do that, but you can talk about a lot of things. You can talk about policy problems and stuff. But human rights, I once did an interview and I didn't really want to, I was nervous about it going forward. made me very, very nervous about it. But that's, I just decided that I'm going to do what I need to do and say what I need to say so I can sleep at night. And be true to myself, because that's the only way that I feel that I can get engaged as much as I do with the mainland.
Thank you very much. David, I know that you were hoping to... I'm so sorry, Ray.
I'd like to have one. David, with regard to the present president, who has made a speech recently about taking down tigers and also going after flies. Now, my question is, David, in terms, there's two areas here I'd like you to reply to. One is the PLA structure, and the other, the bureaucratic structure. Do you feel that this policy will be sustainable? We've seen some initial results, but would this be sustainable over his term in office? And will this contribute to any positiveness in reducing this type of cultural endemic problem that's been going on since 1949? And will this be a positive for China in the long term?
My own view is that there's everybody, I think there's two sides to his strategy. One is he's taking down tigers for the purpose of getting the tigers away so that he enhances his own power. If you want to be the new tiger on the block, to mix metaphors, you got to make sure that the other tigers are weak. And so I think there are certain people that he's wanted to weaken so that he, as the new leader, is freer. On the other hand, I do believe that he is firmly committed to trying to clean the system up, and that he believes that if they don't clean the system up, if they don't get rid of a lot of the really bad corruption, that the party's destined to collapse, and that people will get more and more angry, that the rot from the inside will eventually bring the system down. So I think it's both sides. I think too many people in the West are too quick to just say it's all power. I've always believed that leaders in China are motivated as well by their values. We may not like their values, but I think they are motivated by their values. And I think a very important value for him is to maintain the long-term sustainability of the Communist Party, both for his own interests and also because he believes I'm sure he believes that the Communist Party is the best thing for China, and that that's going to make China strong and great, and it's going to help him fulfill his dream and bring this China dream. So I think it's a mix. So I would think that he's going to try to keep it going. Whether he'll be able to do it, a lot of it, that's the question. But if he keeps bringing down tigers, then it increases his ability to be able to do it, because the people who might be blocking him, he's pulling them down. So we'll see.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And David, thank you very much.